So we're here. This is the second meeting of this study committee. So thanks everybody for being here. We have most of us in person, but Senator Hinsdale is joining us today remotely. Good morning. Welcome.
Hi. Good morning.
I can hear you.
This is
Oh,
Leslie. 12 days old today, I think.
congratulations.
Thank you. So I'll be off video for most of the time.
All right, well, why don't we get started? We have Steve Collier and Alice Eastman here, legal counsel and deputy commissioner of the Agency of Agriculture. And we've invited them to give us a little bit of background, actually maybe a lot of background on the H-2A visa program. And just to sort of set that up, following your presentation, we're going to hear from Damien with a broader look at the agricultural labor in the state. But anyway, we thought we'd start with you. So thanks for joining us. And you have a presentation that you want to put up and share?
Well, I did email it, but we're going to go by our paper copies.
Okay.
Hopefully everybody has it. You certainly have it if you would like. That's great. So for the record, I'm Allison Eastman, Deputy Secretary, and with me is Steve Collier, our General Counsel at the Agency of Agriculture. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today in regards to the H-2A program. For clarity purposes, the H-2A program is administered by Department of Labor, federal and state Department of Labor. So I've really constructed my presentation today around all things public and the framework of the program. So there may be some questions that are labor related that I might not be able to answer, but I will do my best. The first slide represents the United States as it sits. We pay today based on the adverse effect wage rate. We hear many times about minimum wage, adverse effect wage rate, Davis-Bacon, prevailing wage, and the H-2A is expected to pay the highest of those rates. And currently, and many years that I was involved in this program, it has been adverse effect wage rate. So you can see on the map that New England states, inclusive of our Vermont, is paying $17.80 an hour to H-2A workers. And when I say H-2A workers, there are U.S. domestic workers that work underneath these contracts as well. It is expected that an employer will post this opportunity with U.S. Department of Labor 70 to 60 days before the workers arrive to recruit any local U.S. domestic workers that would work underneath that contract. So they oftentimes refer to it as corresponding employment if an individual is doing similar work that does fall underneath these contracts. The next slide shows that there are approximately 70 agricultural businesses in Vermont that have petitioned for approximately 600 workers for the 2024 season. You can see better on this than you can on your paper, kind of where those workers are. So that's representative not of individual employers, obviously, because there's 70, but it does show where the majority of those workers are. You can see the 114 in Middlebury, Middlebury, Cornwall, Shoreham. That area is very widely known for apple production.
I have a question, Representative Chestnut Tangerine.
Yes. Would you like us to hold questions till the end or?
More than welcome to run it any way you wish.
I'm curious about if you know how many of these workers are full-time, how many are seasonal?
Yeah, so the H-2A program is seasonal, and an employer can petition for a worker to stay up to 10 months, no more than 10 months.
Okay.
And it's not a fiscal year in their year as they determine their busiest 10 months. And it is common for workers to stay here 10 months out of the year, especially when you have businesses such as apples where they pick, they pack, and they prune.
Yep.
And then there's other workers that come during the season just to harvest. That happens with our poultry, turkeys for Thanksgiving, as well as apples, fruits, veggie, ground crops. There's a lot of seasonal nature and harvesting involved in those. So it varies depending on the need for the employer.
So are, on dairy farms, which is typically what we think of,
Mhm.
migrant workers, would they be under a different, or would they not be under the H2A because of that 10-month limit usually?
There has been, dairy farms that have come in under the H2A program, but they have to prove a seasonal, temporary or peak load need. And we have had, a dairy farm in the past, that did participate in the program, but it's not widely used in the dairy industry.
Thank you.
It's a great question.
And can I just ask, why would it not be used in the event that a dairy farm could do a rationale? And obviously there are dairy farms that have done a rationale. Is there some advantage or disadvantage if the use of H2A is available? Is there an advantage or disadvantage to dairy farmers qualified to do that?
I think it comes down to, the operation and proving their seasonal temporary need for the program. Many dairy farms are 365, year round.
Yeah.
So it gets difficult to prove that seasonal temporary need. I know for some, and I use the apple industry, for some, you'll go to the local Hannaford's or Shaw's in June and July, and you'll notice that there may not be a lot of local apples. And that's also seems to be the time that we're without those H2A workers to pack and get them to market. So you'll notice that it does affect the products that are going out based on that 8 weeks that they're not here.
And does that 8 weeks have to do with the seasonality of the crop? Or is this 8 weeks somewhat discretionary so that you could have year-round apple production in the event that some farms use a different break period?
That's correct. It's discretionary. It's a good way to explain it.
Okay.
Yes.
Any other questions at the moment? All right.
Excellent.
Oh, yes,
Sorry,
Representative.
it could be 4 weeks, is what you're saying. If the
It
law
has
was
to be
different.
they have to go 8 weeks in a fiscal year.
Because of
Without
the law.
workers, because of the law.
But that's a number out of the air that was picked by somebody at some point in time,
It gets
right?
more complicated than that. A worker can stay here for 3 years. And then go home for their 15-week break, but an employer can only have them here they have to go home for that 8-week period.
Thank you.
So we do transfer workers in Vermont state that will start at fruit and veggies, go pick apples, and then go harvest turkeys. So workers do get moved around based on needs.
And I guess it probably goes without saying that this is federal law, not state law.
That's correct. Yeah, federal law. Mhm. And then I just put down, based on what I saw in the database, is that the program is currently serving in Vermont state apiaries, fruit orchards, diversified fruit and veggie, crop farms, maple, poultry, hop and logging. And then on the next slide, I just wanted to show, based on different parts of the state, their adverse effect wage rate is. So you'll see currently in 2024, then I included the 2023. And then also the 1, 2, and 10-year percent change on these. You'll see that Washington State had the greatest percent change. There's various reasons for that. In my opinion, the Washington State hadn't widely used the H2A program until this last decade. So they had been paying, based on the minimum state and federal wage laws, and then started participating in the program. So, yeah, I mean, these farms and ranches that are relying on foreign-born seasonal workers in the H2A visa program must pay the H2A worker, as I said, the AWARE in its region unless the state minimum wage is higher or the state workforce agency determines through its own survey, which is a prevailing wage survey, that wages in the state are even higher than the adverse effect wage rate. That survey is done by Department of Labor in Vermont. The weights are determined by the number of workers receiving H2A prevailing wage certifications in each state during the most recent federal fiscal year as reported by the DOL. So again, the prevailing wage is what determines these.
Do you know when that number is released, when it's calculated and
Yeah, it used to be released at the end or the beginning of the year, back when I worked the program. But I'm not certain, when it was released this year.
You mentioned earlier, the 60-day opportunity to bring in local workers under the same contracts. Does that mean like anybody doing this work, the harvesting, processing, whatever, would be brought in under this contract? Or would you have a situation where you have workers under this contract being paid one rate and other people doing the same work being paid another rate?
That does happen, the other rate being paid two different rates. And when that happens is if the job order is specific, that they're coming here to pick, but not pack, then the individuals that are here packing could be paid, not according to that contract, but what the employer offers. If there is packing in that job order, then they need to pay according to the contract, the H-2A contract, because it's considered corresponding work.
But you can have employees doing similar work not under this contract.
Correct. And sometimes that happens. They'll see the ad, and then, inquire, and they may have experience in delivery driving, but that's not under the contract, but they still may be offered a job because they need a delivery driver.
Yes.
And then next slide shows just the fact that, the H-2A program, I should probably have started by saying this, it's been around for 90 years, so in the 50s. And I would say Vermont State has been using it for many years. Some of the workers have been coming for 30, if not 40 years to the same employers in our state. Pretty incredible program. So therefore, you do not need to continue to train year after year after year if you have the same workers coming in. So that's pretty convenient. We had originally years ago with the program, the United States had a treaty with the West Indian Islands and we did not have to get a work visa. 9/11 happened and security tightened up with workers traveling to the United States. And so we then had to get visas for all these workers to come in at the same time, and the treaty was no longer there exempting them. Similar thing happened in 2011. They were no longer exempt from paying, being subject to federal and state income tax. So 2011, it started that they were subject to federal income tax. 2012, subject to Vermont. So they can choose not to have federal income tax withheld from their wages, but they are subject to it. So they may have to pay depending on if they're over the maximum allowable deduction.
Do you know whether are both employee and employer required to pay into Social Security and Medicare?
Great question. They're exempt from Social Security and Medicare.
Oh, employer as well.
Employer does not have to match on H-2A wages. But again, you should check that with Department of Labor because I work for the agency of ag. Please feel free to defer any questions to any other agency if it's not your area of expertise. So this is an H-2A visa program. You just mentioned that up until sometime earlier this century, it was not a visa required. Yeah, they traveled on their I-94. They still have to get an I-94 when they come through the port of entry. That's their documentation along with their passport and their work visa. So they have many things to use for identification.
So there's always been something that they had to have in order to enter the country anyway.
Yeah, just a little more formality to it now. Next slide just shows per the H-2A contract what the employer must include. So the beginning and ending dates of the contract period, as well as the locations of work. Any and all significant conditions of employment, including payment for transportation expenses incurred, housing and meals to be provided, and any related charges. Specific days workers are not required, whether they take off their day of Sabbath, federal holidays, and they usually have a day of rest in the week. The hours per day and per week that they will be expected to work, the crop and the job to be performed, the applicable rates for each job. It's not uncommon for them to get paid a piece rate, but they must guarantee an hourly rate of $17.80. If they're quick pickers, they may make more than that $17.80 if they're paid by the piece. Also, the tools required, supplies and equipment will be provided at no charge. Workers' compensation insurance will be provided at no charge. And then the last, any deduction not otherwise required by law. All deductions must be reasonable, and any deduction not specified is not permissible for the contract. Next slide is on 3/4 guarantee. This one can be tricky, but all workers are guaranteed 3/4 of the contract. So if it's a 10-week contract and the employer's offering 48 hours per week, that would be 480 hours, which means that they have to guarantee they're going to get paid the 360 hours at $17.80 an hour. It's interesting, and I think we're well aware with the weather that we've seen recently, that sometimes weather related, it's hard for an employer to guarantee that 3/4 wage guarantee. So there is an act of God and the ability for the employer or their agent to apply for a contract impossibility to the US Department of Labor with their reasoning why they can't meet those needs. And then once approved, they can send the workers home early and not meet that 3/4 wage guarantee.
For the 3/4 wage guarantee, if there's, a pause in work or not enough, can they have workers do work outside the contract?
They should be working within the contract only.
Okay.
Does that happen?
Everything happens.
Housing. Employers must provide housing at no cost to H-2A workers and those that are in corresponding employment. So those methods that may be working under this contract as well. We're not reasonably able to return to their residence within the same day, not within the commuting distance. If the employer elects to secure a rental, public accommodations for workers, the employer is required to pay all housing related charges directly to the housing management. In addition, employers are required to either provide each covered worker with 3 meals per day at no more than the DOL specified cost, which is roughly just under $16. I believe it's $15.88 right now per day for 3 meals, or furnish free of charge a convenient cooking and kitchen facilities where the workers can prepare their own meals. And then the employers
Sorry,
provide,
yeah, we have a question here.
go ahead.
Excuse me, on the housing element of it, that isn't included as a deduction though, right? If it's provided at no cost.
It has to be provided at no cost.
And it wouldn't be part of the deductions for wage or anything considered in that.
Correct. No, it would be an illegal deduction. It is required that they pay for housing as part of the job contract.
Okay, good.
Mhm. And then also housing has to provide and meet all applicable safety standards and local and federal requirements. So it is inspected by Department of Labor. And actually in this state, Department of Labor has an MOU with the Agency of Ag. So we work in collaboration. We have inspectors that are throughout the state in our public health ag resource management. So we figured we would utilize those inspectors to assist with the housing inspections and report back to DOL, which has worked pretty good, I would say, for 2 or 3 years now. On to transportation, the next slide, similar to housing, employers must provide daily transportation between the workers' living quarters and the employer's work site at no charge. Employer provided transportation must meet all safety standards, be properly insured and operated by a licensed driver. Inbound and outbound expenses to or from where they're coming from their home country or whether they're transferring from an employer here in the States. The employer must reimburse the workers for those reasonable costs incurred for the inbound. Transportation plus subsistence. So if they're traveling for a day, they get paid for their 3 meals at the time that they're traveling. So they have to be reimbursed at $15.88 or $59 if they have receipts. That's the maximum they can go up to with receipts. Happy to take any questions. Not seeing any, we'll move on to the next slide. Go ahead. Yes.
And the inbound and outbound expenses, the FLSA, what
Fair Labor Standards Act.
Thank you.
And
Other questions?
INA is Immigration Nationality Act. I think I referenced INA a few times. Make sure you're right. H-2A contract records required. Employers must keep accurate records of the number of hours worked, offered each week, day by the employer, and the hours actually worked each day by the employer. So per the contract, if you're offering 7 hours a day, 6 days a week, 42 hours, and you have rain for 4 hours of it, then that means you probably did not offer 7, you offered 3, and they worked 3. So your record keeping must accurately reflect such. Honor before each day period, which must be at least twice monthly. At minimum, each worker must be given an hours earning statement showing the hours offered and actually worked, the hourly rate and or piece rate if applicable. And if piece rates are used, the units produced daily. The hours and earnings statement must also indicate the total earnings for the pay period and all deductions from wages. I'm not going to bore you with reading the last sign. It's additional insurance and obligations per Immigration Nationality Act. So if they have a fee they pay for, anything that they pay for to be recruited and brought here needs to be reimbursed by the employer. That's basically what this is saying. There is to be no expense paid for by the employee for the means of recruitment. Last one is questions, and Stephen, my contact information. So happy to take questions.
Representative Chestnut Tanner.
In the middle of previous slide. Line, employers must assure that there is no strike or lockout in the course of the labor dispute. And so the employers can certainly assure that there's no lockout, but the strike that's how do employers assure there's no strike?
That would be a question for later, I believe, not for me. That is, and again, federal wage and hour, federal laws too. The fact sheet that I referred to, number 26 is available online.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think agriculture is interesting, as you're well aware, when it comes to facing, strikes with perishable crops and animal welfare.
Absolutely.
I'd imagine that that's probably taken into consideration.
I'm trying to understand that being on the employer.
Well, I don't know what the law says on that ground, but that comes from federal law. It's possible it's preempting the ability to strike in that program to protect the workers. That's just one possibility. That's something we could obviously figure out. And I'm sure your legislative council may already know the answer to that, but it would just depend on the framework. As you know, collective bargaining is exempted from the Fair Labor Standards Act, so it hasn't been, under federal law, striking farm workers has not been an issue. So I suspect that it's designed to protect the migrant, the H-2A workers who come here to make sure that they are able to continue to work. They come here to earn money, and I think it's probably designed to ensure they can earn what they're promised. But that's a guess.
Striking would be not being paid under the
Contracts.
under the contract.
They could come here and not have any work, which would not serve their interests very well.
Thanks, I was just looking for something.
Yeah, I think we need to, it does seem a little bit inconsistent to, Other questions? Senator,
Thank you. The last sentence on page 10, I just wanted to get a clearer picture. So the hours and earnings statement includes total earnings and all deductions from wages. Is that strictly just state and federal income taxes, or what else is deducted?
There may be meal deductions if the employer provides meals. So it's anything that's in their contract that's allowed as a deduction under the contract.
the wage, whatever it is, $17 and some cents for Vermont at the moment, that's paid regardless of how many hours a week or work. So there's no overtime adjustment for above
That's
work hours.
correct. It's not uncommon for farm workers to work 60, 80, And sometimes we see as high as 100 hours a week.
You talked about at the beginning, the fact that there probably, generally speaking, aren't a lot of dairy farms or dairy farm workers as part of this program. We talked about apples. Is it largely, in fact, apple orchards that are the employers here, or tell us more if you know about who the employers are, what they're doing.
I think there's a couple ways to look at it. If you look at the number of workers, there's many that come in for a short period of time to pick apples. But there are a number of employers outside of apples that are doing fruit, veggie, ground crops, poultry, that bring in workers. It's just they don't bring in the mass of workers that the apple producers do.
There'll be a lot of people picking apples at particular time of year.
Yeah, for that 8 to
Yeah.
12-week stay. Mhm.
And then maybe a smaller number doing other things, turkeys you mentioned also. probably.
Yeah, so we have poultry farms that utilize it, many months out of the year, not just for harvest for Thanksgiving, but, it's primarily they come in March and I want to say stay through December. That's likely the time that the poultry operations utilize the H2A program.
You mentioned that there are some small number of dairy farms that have used this in the past. Is there any place in which we could look at the basis for which those farms were able to establish the seasonality or the limited period of time that justified their participation in the program?
So I only know of one dairy farm in Vermont that's utilized the program. And it's a federal database that's public. We certainly, and I think as they've reached their succession planning in life with their farm, they're no longer using the H2A program. So in Vermont state, it's hard to really cast a wide net and understand, how people are using it in the dairy industry. I know in New York of a farm that was using it that was very seasonal in their nature. They dried off all their cows at the same time of year and took weeks off. The individual farm that was utilizing it in Vermont was not seasonal in that nature. And I think they tied it more so to they were busy seasonally doing crop work. But we most certainly could ask them those questions.
Senator Bartley.
Yeah, so approximately 600 workers were petitioned to work in Vermont for the 2024 season to date. Is it an ongoing application process? Can a farmer start an application today, later?
That's a wonderful question. The way that the federal program works is that it's illegal to falsify your dates of need. So it's impossible to do a job order from March through December for all of your workers. If you don't expect to bring in the picking workers until August through October.
Yeah.
Means it's a separate job order for that time. So it's not uncommon to see some employers have 2, 3, maybe as much as 4 different job contracts. Which you can imagine is a lot to manage, right? Before you send a worker home, making sure they've met their 3/4 wage guarantee and that you as the employer have fulfilled the contract that you were expected to do.
And how long does the application process take?
If you were to ask a farmer, an employer, probably their answer would say too long.
Yeah.
So just to give you a rough idea, they advertise and send the opportunity to Vermont Department of Labor 70 to 60 days prior to date of need. Then they're required to send it to Federal Department of Labor 45 to 60 days prior to date of need. They have to show Federal Department of Labor and it goes through the State Department of Labor as to what they've, had for recruitment. The job has all been advertised during that time, how many people have applied. So if they've petitioned for 20 workers and 2 have applied and they've decided to hire, they'll only get approved for 18. At that point, they then have to petition immigration. Immigration will go through, it takes roughly 30 because it's a perishable crop. It goes through pretty quick with immigration. 30, maybe 45 days, the approval comes through, at which time the workers are asked to go in for their interview. They then get their visa. And then hopefully they're on a flight coming up here to work. So there's a lot of dates that need to be met. And it is very timely and stressful for all involved to make sure that it's done timely.
Okay.
Representative Jessup Tanger?
So I expect Damien will, well, I'll ask him to weigh in on this also, but we have been, in our first meeting, we were making a distinction between agricultural workers and processing jobs. And this morning, we've been talking about picking and processing, and I'm just wondering what those, are federal distinctions different than state distinctions? Am I just opening a can of worms here?
I'll tee up your can of worms. And then the lawyer's gonna have to clean up my mess. I just So the way, that in my experience, the way that the federal wage and hour always looked at manufacturing or processing is when you're changing the state of what you produced, it becomes manufacturing, and at that point, subject to paying overtime. And agricultural, if we're asking, I think you asked when it's not agricultural. So to qualify for the H-2A program, you must be agricultural. And we do know that we process goods under ag. But if what you're processing is what you grew, it's agricultural. When you go to a slaughter facility and they're buying in animals from somebody else that they didn't grow, then they're deemed not agricultural and they get H-2B workers, which are non-ag.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
So it's the processing of on-farm goods.
That they have. Yes.
Produce themselves.
And to give you a little more meat to the potatoes, with agriculture, and we'll use apples again because it's easier. We know that they process cider, make pies, donuts. And as soon as they change the state of that apple, they then have to pay, or they're subject to overtime.
And is there still that requirement of in the production aspect, 50% be produced on the farm? I mean, thinking of donuts, where you're mixing in cider from the farm. But
Yeah, so I'm stepping in labor's questions right now, and
Yeah.
we will let Damien clean up my mess, but those are very good questions. And I will say that our apple orchards deal with that every day, but we have had apple orchards in our state that have had US wage and hour audits, and if they buy apples in from another orchard, they're subject to time and a half on that line.
But if I can just add in,
Yeah.
very confusingly, it's not the same standards that we use under Act 250 or accessory on farm business. It's all federal and or potentially state law that's determining whether or not it's agriculture. So it's the definitions you may be more familiar with don't necessarily the same, which is one of the many ways that farming is so challenging, or any business, but trying to navigate all the different relationships between different laws that require different things. It can be quite challenging. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. Thank you.
Couple questions. The program's been around for a long time, as you said, and there are workers who come back year after year. Are the employers pretty familiar now with the details, or are you providing, constantly having to provide assistance to new employers, or have the rules changed? Or what, I'm wondering, what's the role that you have to play, the agency, in providing guidance?
Yeah, we mostly refer them to Department of Labor and the contact at Department of Labor. I think the program in itself is super intimidating for an employer to jump into. Because of the regulations, we'll email them the H-2A handbook, just so they have a little info to read before they make those calls. Once an employer is in the program, in my experience, after 2, 3, 4 years, they really understand, and it is, the same thing each year in the application process and such. So they become pretty secure with applying for those workers. There's something that really probably should be mentioned with H-2A, and we're fortunate that there's never been a cap on the program, meaning that the federal government has never said you're only allowed X amount of workers to come into the United States, which is incredible because the H-2A program does have a cap and it's really made it difficult on those non-ag businesses. If you're in the program, and you apply next year, those workers that came in the previous year don't count towards the cap. So once you're in the program, that's great, right? You'd think you'd be able to get your workers back year after year, but if you're not in the program and the program's reached the cap, then it's pushing, employers out that want to seek, migrant labor. So it's unfortunate.
That's for the processors, you're saying?
Yeah, it's for all. I mean, this is ski resorts, it's H-2B, so it's not
H-2B.
ag. Yeah. And the H-2B program has had a cap on it for a long time.
So the 10-month cap, is that on the employer or on the employee?
That's on the employer
So an employee could stay here
longer.
longer, working different contracts.
Correct.
And there's no limit, or is there, a threshold number for the number of employees that a farmer might have to have?
Not aware of, not that I'm aware of.
So small
Not-
farms, medium farms, big farms?
Right, they can petition for what their need is. And I've seen farms petition for 1, I've seen farms petition for 200.
So if there's no federal cap, then is there effectively no, I'm just thinking about supply and demand and whether farms who apply petition are able typically to get somebody to come in and fill the need that they've identified.
Yes, as long as they meet the requirements of the program.
All right, are there any other questions? All right, should we let you go early? Steve Collier, did you have anything you wanted to add or?
Sure, if you have a minute, I would just say that we are really thankful that you're looking at this issue. And it's something that we feel like the legislature needs to become more involved in farming because we're very concerned about what's happening to agriculture in Vermont. And the relationship between farm workers and farms has to be symbiotic. I mean, they both need each other and we don't have one without the other. So I think in whatever change that you're contemplating, if farm viability has to be part of that equation. And obviously the appropriate protections for the workers to make their careers fulfilling as well. But it's the overlay is we just keep losing farms and farmland at a precipitous rate. And so I just think finding how to make the balance where we can, instead of losing farms, keep, ideally actually grow them. But we're just, I don't think most Vermonters, I don't think understand that we have lost more than 50% of our farmland since Act 250 was enacted, which is just amusing at a point in time, not faulting Act 250, but Act 250 was developed in large part to try to preserve farmland. Even in the last 5-year census from 2017 to 2022, we lost 11% of our harvested cropland in Vermont. 5-year period, 11% of our cropland gone. That doesn't come back. It either gets developed or it turns into woods, oftentimes. So it's just whatever we do, and farms don't make money. I don't think people necessarily understand that. Most of our farms don't make a profit. Most farms need to have their people who live on the farm working somewhere off the farm in order to stay viable. And in terms of the farm and farm worker equation, the most farms, at least most dairy farms, also provide farm worker housing, which is a huge piece of the equation in terms of what is being provided as part of the expense. I mean, the median cost of housing right now in Vermont is, I think, something like $1,500 for a studio. So some farm worker housing is probably not at all where it should be. And to that seems like a legitimate question for us, is to make sure that the farm worker housing is appropriate. but then that has to stay as part of the equation when you're evaluating what's appropriate. And we also really worry about overtime. I mean, overtime, everybody wants overtime, and the workers that the hours that some farm workers work are extreme. But from what we understand, they're also voluntary in that they're earning a lot of money on purpose. And that's part of the equation, is a lot of farm workers are working 72 hours. If you reduce that, if you required overtime, it's not at all clear to me that farmers would not just hire more people and not pay them overtime. So actually the workers could be harmed by that if they're no longer getting the same amount of money that they're expecting to get. Or not, this is not in the H-2A program, but farmers could just lower the rate they pay. Right now, I think farmers are mostly paying around $18 an hour on dairy farms, which is far above the minimum wage. And there is no minimum wage except for the federal minimum wage for farmers. So they could just lower the rate and charge overtime so that they're getting the same pay overall that they were. So I just think I understand the historical narrative and the importance of correcting historical wrongs, and that is vital. But we also have to navigate today's farm environment. So when we're figuring out how to make this relationship between farms and their employees work, it's just pivotal from our perspective that we also are thinking, how can we keep farms here? Because we're not keeping them here. We have some wonderful expansions in some areas of farming. Agriculture is changing in Vermont. That's wonderful, but every time we put a different cost, that has ripple effects. And so we keep thinking, how do we keep farmers active? How do we help them diversify? How do we make sure they can be productive? But at some point, we're either going to have 10 big farms that do dairy and then a lot of other farms doing other things, or we're going to have more diversified agriculture across the state. But if we don't have any farmland, none of that's going to happen. And the pressures, the cost of land and the pressures on farmland are really exorbitant. When you are not making money and you have 300 acres of land, the easiest way to change that situation is to sell your land and to sell it for development. And we don't want that. Obviously, that's someone's right to do. But if we want to produce food in Vermont, if we want to be part of the regional economy and the agricultural economy, we've got to step up our game. I mean, Vermont and Maine are really the only states in New England that are viable for big time agriculture in terms of growing a lot of our food. But we're only viable because we have that tradition, that land base. But the easiest land to develop is the land that's already cleared, the land that's already ready to go, and that's our farmland. So we talk about especially with climate change and how that's impacting Vermont and impacting farms, like not growing our food locally is going to be a problem. We're actually very well set up in Vermont to adapt to climate change in terms of relative to other places. Because we're in a colder climate, we will have probably a longer growing season. None of this is what we want, but it's a reality that if we could actually probably become more productive in Vermont, but not if we don't have the land. So all of these, we're trying to think 50 years down the road, not just today. And that includes having farm workers being paid what they deserve and being treated appropriately. That's necessary to the farming industry, but implore everyone to think about, if we're making changes, how do we do that to work for farms and their employees, not one or the other.
And personally, I'd like to say that as far as housing goes, there has not been a lot of money financially to go into farm worker housing. And this year, we were fortunate to partner with the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative, had ARPA funds. And if you haven't seen it, the housing that was done at Riverview Dairy, the Benjamins up north, it was a net zero home, and Working Lands was able to help with that funding. This year, the board has not been able to prioritize housing with the $1 million base funding that we received, but it's important to note that the board is set up to move money towards housing, and it's been very positive and nice to see on that farm.
Only if we have time.
We do have time.
This is kind of outside the purview of this group, but talking about land use, and it seems to be very common. I guess of checking in with you, how common is this, that under Act 250, farmers will hay a field that's owned by somebody else, keep the hay, the landowner benefits because the land qualifies for Act 250, farmer gets the hay without paying the taxes on the land.
Current use.
I'm sorry, what did I say? I'm sorry, no, current use, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, that seems like a symbiosis that works, and just wondering if you know how common that is, how viable that is.
We probably have access to the statistics. I don't know them off the top of my head, but we absolutely think the current use is invaluable to agriculture in Vermont. One complaint that we hear from farmers, and I think they believe it's very valuable as well, but the tax benefits, are newer to the landowner, not to the farmer. Now, having access to that land is very important, but that's not the same as getting a favorable market rate for the land. And so that, whether or not the balance is exactly right, we're not sure. We're thinking about those issues, but we absolutely, there's more farmland available to farmers because of the current use program, because of the tax benefits to landowners who allow farmers to use it. It is a critical program. It's one of the things like Act 250 that were designed over the years to try to protect farmland. And those things have been successful. It's just they haven't stopped the serious with it. They've slowed it. They just haven't stopped the rate of decline.
And I guess my follow-up question, and I don't know if you have any idea, but that we talk about loss of farmland, but some of it is reforestation and some is development. Do you know what that split is?
I don't personally know that. I think it's pretty hard to get that exactly. It's much easier to track what we're losing than to track where it goes to. I think right now, the latest statistics are about 9% of Vermont's land mass is in active agricultural production. Going back, if you go back 100 years, it was 80%. If you go back 50 years, it was 43%. If you go back, it just keeps going down. But at one point, we were 85% cleared in farmland. Now we've only got 9% of our land left that's being farmed. And so I don't know the distinction. Obviously, we're very heavily forested state now. So
in my area, I see a lot more fields growing up than
absolutely
development.
You go up on a hike on a mountain peak almost anywhere now, and it's amazing how fewer open fields there are in some parts of the state.
Could that also just be possibly the shift in what the agricultural industry itself is? We're not a sheep state anymore. And so that necessity for depth of cleared land has shifted to more intensive row crops.
Of course. I mean, that's a piece of it. But on the other hand, no matter what you're doing in ag, you need open land. And so the expense of clearing it or reclaiming it, and if it's developed, you've almost certainly lost it. But even the expense of reclaiming it is very difficult. And the regulations are very much different to do that now. If you have forest, you probably also have wetland. And so if you have a farm field, that's a farm field. But trying to reclaim farmland is really difficult. So yes, the way that we farm has changed, but we also, even though climate change is going to be changing this dynamic, we are a cold weather state. So thinking about how we move agriculture, there's agriculture during the growing season, and then there's also hopefully agriculture not during the growing season. And I think that's why dairy is successful here, is because they can milk cows in January. So having that balance between, growing all the food that we can, but also having year-round industry is probably important in the processing that comes, the apple, from the apple orchards and the Ben & Jerry's and the Cabots and those kinds of things. Those ripple effects are much broader than just the farm communities themselves. But making use of the land from our agency's perspective, and our secretary is very clear about this, our deputy secretary is very clear about this. We support all ag. We don't care what it is. We just want it to be successful. But when most farms don't make money, and most farms, we've lost over 25% of our dairy farms just since COVID, lost 4% of our farms overall just in the last 5-year census period. So whatever you can do, great, but the margins are not favorable for farming. And keeping in mind, farmers in Vermont are competing with farmers around the country and around the world. And that's a big piece of this. If it costs more to make it here, people aren't going to buy it. So some people will, who can. But if we really want to feed people who don't have the money to pay more, then we've got to be cognizant about trying to keep our expenses for farmers as close to the mean as possible. Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Staying on tangents. I will go to Act 250.
My fault, I'm sorry.
I think it's chilling to think that we've lost 50% of farmland during the 50 years of Act 250. And
More than that, it's like 56%, I think. Yeah.
we're looking at more changes to Act 250 that were just instituted. Who can we talk with outside this room, perhaps? Who would be projecting how much farmland we're going to lose with the latest developable land encouragement through changes in Act 250?
Well, I think, all of the state agencies, all of the groups that are interested in this across the state and how we regulate land use in Vermont is critical to our future. And it's complicated because people have very different interests on what they want to see. And no one's right. But
Those of us who are pro-ag are up against the development community, right? And so where do we find a nexus of folks? Is it purely the ag agency, or are there other groups that we could talk with that could help?
there's many other groups, but we are happy and want to be involved in those conversations. And we have some ideas that we're hoping to bring to the legislature this year. But the conservation is one path, which works to some extent. But what really needs to happen is we have to have an environment where farms can make money. Because if farms can make money in Vermont, then they will the farmers love doing it. They want to farm. It's hard to get new farmers. That's another big issue. We've got to attract the next generation. But if farms can farm in Vermont and make money, they will stay here. If they can't, they won't. And I think that's more important than any regulation that you can draw is how can we make farms profitable?
So if I could just add, Senator Rand and I are on the Senate Ag Committee. From what I understand about what we passed, though, very little of what would be considered farmland is in play in that most recent revision of Act 250. If you're talking about designated downtown areas and village centers, you're not talking about, for the most part, farmland. You're talking about areas that are already developed. You just haven't completed it, if you will. So I'm not sure that. And I'm sure there's more work to be done on Act 250. To me, it was very helpful for certain areas of the state and a little less so in other areas. I just wanted to ask too, are we under 500 dairy farms now?
Yes, 470.
Boy.
649 in January of 2020, 474, the last statistic that I saw, it might be 479. I think mine was in June, and it's, yeah.
This guy's statistics stick in his head.
Man.
I mean, I'm not to say my numbers right.
Well, even if it's just under 500, and they're larger farms in many cases too.
Our large farms has stayed the same, 35.
But that's a real concern of ours, Senator, is those even the mid-sized farms that, that everybody's had to get bigger to survive. But the economies of scale have become so overwhelming that we're pushing out the small farms, and it's sad. And we want farming of all kinds, but if it's not viable for somebody unless they own 2,000 acres, that's a pretty significant change in Vermont farming too. And we don't want just 10 farms.
Right.
So.
All right, I don't see any other questions. So Deputy Secretary, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invite.
General Counsel, Collier, thank you.
Steve is great. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I misidentified Allison's title earlier.
You're fine.
For the record, why don't we take 10 minutes and then, so it's now just before 11, so just before 11:10, we'll jump back in with our next